Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video of HBI podcast. Today I'm joined by Professor Bruce Chilton, and today we'll be discussing his book that he co-authored with the late Jacob Neusner, The Brother of Jesus, James the Just, and His Mission. So welcome back to the show, Bruce.
Many thanks. Good to be with you.
So let's get right into it. In the subtitle, you mentioned you and Neusner mentioned that James the Just has a mission. And what do you think, and what do you and the late Neusner think that his mission was exactly?
Mhm. Yes, this project, which came out with Westminster John Knox, followed an earlier volume that we did with Brill called James the Just and Christian Origins. And our purpose throughout all of these projects was to gather scholars together who joined in our work because there is a unique difficulty about studying James, and that is he is clearly an influential figure, and yet there is no single source which is primarily dedicated to giving us information about him. There's nothing like a gospel for James, the brother of Jesus. You need to glean data about James from diverse resources, from the New Testament, from resources of early Christianity, early Judaism, including the Qumran scrolls. And for that reason, we gathered scholars together who could evaluate those resources. And the volume that we did with Brill made it clear to us that James was establishing a distinctive understanding of what the purpose was in continuing the preaching of Jesus after Jesus' death and under the influence of his resurrection. And that's what we mean by the mission of James. That is, bringing an understanding of the significance of Jesus to, as it were, his native environment, to the practice of Judaism, but also, and this to my mind is an important feature of our work, also including non Jews. Uh, one of the ways in which the evaluation of James has suffered over the past now nearly 200 years is that he's seen as being simply a counter figure to Paul. And because Paul is very much in favor of including Gentiles, it's easy to fall into the trap of supposing that therefore James didn't wish to include Gentiles. That is not the case. What it appears to us is that James quite clearly saw the center of the movement as being a matter of the continuation of Judaism, but that it should also include those who had not been born into Israel.
Do you think that James and Jesus believed in exactly the same things, or do you think there may have been some differences between the two?
I think that there were differences between them, and to some extent, these differences were biographical. Jesus put enormous stresses on his own family. He had disappeared from his home environment during his teenage years. He returned again and came to be recognized locally and then through Galilee as being a rabbi. And that put strains on his own family, especially because Jesus' birth was known to be irregular. And therefore, Jesus did not have the same right of entering into a congregation of Israelites, for example, into a synagogue, that James himself did. And so that meant that it was a difficult family environment. And it appears to be the case that there was only truly a reconciliation at the time that Jesus went to Jerusalem for his final journey there, because it is there that we find James present. And also, there's a source not in the New Testament, but quoted by the church father Jerome, which shows James is in a position to be aware of what the significance of Jesus' resurrection was.
You mentioned earlier that James is such an important figure in the early Christian movement and still is today. But despite that fact, like you said earlier, we have no primary source dedicated to this man, no gospel. But later on, we seem to have attempts at fixing that issue in the later centuries, like with the proto-evangelium of James and other texts like that. Do you think there may have been a gospel of James, or any evidence of that being cited by church fathers as lost?
I think that there was a Gospel of James in the sense that James had his own particular understanding of the gospel of Jesus. I take as my index for the development of very early gospel versions the account that Paul gives of a meeting in Jerusalem with Peter and with James. And by Paul's chronology, this is around the year 35. And he says around that time, he consulted with Peter and James, and this contributed to Paul's own distinctive understanding of the gospel. Now, in Paul's case as well, we don't actually have a gospel according to Paul, but we do have his letters from which we can infer what the main emphases of his teaching were. In much the same way, we can see as a result of the impact of James what his primary concentration was.
Is there anything that can be gleaned over the text called the Epistle of James? I know that scholars don't think James or ever Jesus wrote it, although I think there's a couple that do. But the beginning of the text says some guy called James wrote it, but doesn't specify who it was. What do you make of all that?
Yes, I think myself that the letter of James is definitely designed to be read as being from James, the brother of Jesus, or although you're completely right, it doesn't explicitly identify itself. And part of that lack of being explicit is, I think, a good reason to be cautious, as you are suggesting. One of the scholars that we worked with during the whole course of our James project, Peter Davids, is much more inclined to see a degree of James' own personal contribution within the letter. Having said that, I think myself that it's clear that the Epistle of James is something that is written in order to adapt the perspective of James to the wider environment of the Mediterranean world to which it is actually directed. I mean, the letter says that it's going out to the 12 clan groups, the 12 tribes who are in the diaspora. Well, that suggests to me that you're looking at a moment in Christianity where it's established itself as being a phenomenon across the Greco-Roman world. It's acquiring a perspective which is increasingly called Catholic, that is universal, cross-cultural. So I think the letter actually does show the influence of James, but I would agree with those who doubt that it was personally composed by James. Without any question, however, whoever wrote it was not fully in accord with the theology of Paul. And that's a very helpful reminder to us that in earliest Christianity, Paul is just one voice. As it happens, that voice is disproportionately apparent in the New Testament as we have it. But during the course of the first century, voices such as James were in fact more influential.
You mentioned that there appears to be overlap between the Jamesian theology and the M material in Matthew's gospel, Matthew's special material with the Clementine text. Could you elaborate on this?
Yes, I think it is important to bear in mind the perspective of James insofar as we can gather it from sources which, as we've said, don't directly commit themselves to him principally. However, uh, within the Acts of the Apostles in chapter 15, James is made the determinative figure in establishing what the mission of earliest Christianity should be. So, to go back to your first question, basically, Acts 15 gives you a mission statement of what the Christianity of James looked like. And its view is quite clear that those who have not been born into Israel, those who therefore have not practiced circumcision, can in fact enter into the fellowship of the church by means of baptism, and therefore be understood to be a part of the whole movement of salvation that Jesus represents. At the same time, James holds that those who join themselves to the movement in order to show their respect for the Torah without keeping the whole of the Torah need to keep certain provisions. So they should not eat food that has been notionally sacrificed to idols, as widely occurred within the Greco-Roman world. They are to abstain from blood, from animals which have been strangled in order to be killed. Excuse me. Jacob, I'm going to have to take just a moment.
Sure.
Excuse me, we're in allergy season, and the pollen has in fact got to me from time to time.
No problem, Bruce. Yeah, I hate it when that happens.
Yeah, I know. When it hits you, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah, we were talking about the James M material Clementine overlap.
Exactly. That's right. So I'll just take it from my description of the apostolic decree, okay?
That's fine.
Good. So, under the authority of James, a council of the apostles sets out that non-Jews, people not born into Israel, may join the movement of Jesus by means of baptism without being required to keep circumcision or the other particular provisions of the Torah that apply to Israelites. At the same time, James does make requirements of Gentiles who join the church so that they show their recognition of the Torah. This is one of the ways in which James and Paul part company. According to the understanding of James, which is formally adapted by the Apostolic Council, those who attach themselves to the church by means of baptism have to separate themselves from certain practices of the Greco-Roman world. They may not eat food which has been notionally sacrificed to idols, as frequently occurred. They're not to consume blood or animals that have been strangled in order to kill them prior to butchery. And they are to keep apart from all forms of incest, including marriages which involve relations which are not permitted within the Torah. Now, these are not, as compared to all the requirements of the Torah, stringent requirements, but they are nonetheless requirements. And James justifies this point of view by quoting from the book of Amos and saying that the reason for this development, for this inclusion of Gentiles into the movement is so that the tent of David could again be restored. In other words, James takes part in a Davidic messianic expectation centered on Jesus as someone who is the representative of that dynasty. And by the way, that also implies James himself, who by his relationship to Joseph is also one of the descendants of David. So within this understanding, James then is particularly affiliated with those materials that stress the importance of Jesus' descendants from David and the way in which that descendants unfolds throughout the whole history of Israel. This is precisely what happens within the genealogy of Matthew's gospel in particular, and also stresses the importance of the Davidic lineage of Jesus himself as being part of the promise of what God is fulfilling in terms of the messianic expectations of Israel. And this represents a intersection among the preaching of James, the special material within Matthew's gospel, typically called M, and also the Clementine literature.
A while back, we did a video about the synoptic problem in which you connect M with James and L with Barnabas. So just to receive some clarification, are you saying that James is responsible for all of the M material in Matthew, or only part of it? And same question for Barnabas, is he likewise responsible for everything in L?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say when I identify all of these streams of tradition, because they are streams, they tend to be named after whatever their headwaters were. That is, whether you're talking about Peter or James or Barnabas, these are the points of initiation. In all of these cases, it seems to me that one can see developments of the streams over time, even prior to the moment that they were incorporated within the Gospels. And also, at times, each of these figures is actually associated with a follower who further develops the material. So, for example, in the case of Peter, first letter of Peter written in his name, again, like the letter of James, I don't think it's directly written by Peter, but it's from this stream of tradition. That letter refers with quite a degree of emphasis to a person called my son Mark, who I think is not the evangelist, but is someone who adapted Peter's tradition over time. In the case of James, he, in that same chapter of Acts I referred to, chapter 15, is also associated with those who promulgate his teaching on his own behalf. And I think it's quite clear that we can see their influence. And so it is the case with Barnabas. Barnabas is associated with other figures, also in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 13. And I think that they are responsible for the adaptation of the Barnaban stream of material before it's incorporated within the Gospels. So each of the streams is a living river of tradition, which is adopted over time.
Okay, so basically you're not saying that James and Barnabas wrote respectively the nativity stories of Matthew and Luke. Those stories developed over time, like prodigal son, the parable of the two sons, all this special material came later after Barnabas and James. people, members of their communities, are developing this stuff. Is what you're saying?
Exactly, that they develop these materials. And sometimes you can also see particular interests being developed. In all cases, it does appear to be the case that there is an increasing emphasis upon eschatology as you approach the time of the Jewish revolt during the 60s. And then after that, of course, the Gospels themselves come into existence, and therefore each of the Gospel writers has to confront the issue of how to deal with some of the disappointed hopes of eschatology, which had put forward the expectation that confrontation of the Romans with the Romans would mean the intervention of God with Jesus as the Son of Man. Disappointment about that, I think, is one of the reasons for which the Gospels were composed.
What do you make of the Clementine literature in general, especially the aspects of it about James? Do you think that some of it could contain text that go back to the first century? Because I know that a lot of scholars tend to think that Clementine literature is extremely late and dismiss it as pseudo-epigrapha and completely irrelevant.
Well, I would not say it's completely irrelevant. On the other hand, the whole of this literature, the Clementines, the Proto-Evangelium of James, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, all of these are, I think, examples of the development of early Christianity rather than earliest Christianity. In other words, they are articulated within the frame of reference of no earlier than the 2nd century and sometimes a bit later. And for that reason, in order to develop any of that material, one has to enter into the question of how to allow for that change of context.
So when Paul confronts James, as he recounts in his letter to the Galatians, he's confronting him with the fact that Paul knows he has a disadvantage, that he never met Jesus. James is Jesus' brother. And Paul tries to make it look like that. In spite of the fact that he never met Jesus, he confronts James and says that his vision gives him better knowledge of Jesus than James ever had. That's what to me, it looks like that's how it reads, that Paul's coming out with this very arrogant attitude. What do you think Paul was trying to do when he unleashed like that upon James?
I think that Paul's position is to some extent the result of the episodic interactions that he had with James and also with Peter. I referred to this position that James took, which turned out to be determinative for Christianity, that it should be possible for non-Jews to enter into the movement of Jesus by means of baptism without any requirement of keeping the covenant of circumcision. This is a major development, and it meant that the group that was present in this apostolic council, which I think Acts permits us to date together with the letters of Paul in the year 46, that this position would be one that was binding for the practice of the movement as a whole. And Paul quite clearly entered into full agreement with that without any question whatever. And then Paul, because of that agreement, primarily put his emphasis on the preaching to the Gentiles. And indeed, he establishes his own reputation as being an apostle to the Gentiles. The difficulty about the position of the Apostolic Council in 46, however, was that it only answered one part of the social situation with the conversion of non-Jews to Christianity brought about. If one accepts that Gentiles can enter into the movement without entering into the covenant of circumcision, it does raise the question, what kinds of interactions can they have with others in the movement at that time, the predominant part of the movement, who in fact were practicing within the traditional understanding of Judaism? And that's why something happened at Antioch, which proved to be extremely difficult, namely that you had the perfectly natural interaction of believers, both practitioners of Judaism and not, who would eat together, who would practice not only Eucharist together, but also common meals. Was that something that could be approved on the basis of the findings of the Apostolic Council that permitted non-Jews to join into the movement? Here you had a clear mark of demarcation, because the position of Paul is clearly enunciated in his letter to the Galatians, that both Gentile believers and Jewish believers should in fact eat together. The position of James, articulated again by a meeting in Jerusalem, but in my opinion, a later meeting than Paul himself took part in, had set out the requirements I referred to earlier, that in order to put themselves in a sufficient state of purity to interact with Israelites who had been baptized, Gentiles who were baptized had to keep certain practices in order to recognize the authority of the Torah. This is a major division, and in the middle of this division, Peter found himself, because Paul charges, and it's probably accurate, that Peter had been interacting right across the movement in Antioch. He had been eating both with Gentile believers and Jewish believers. But then, when emissaries came from James, he stopped doing so. This is what causes Paul, by his own account, to go into a tirade against not only the emissaries of James and Peter, but also Barnabas, who had been Paul's principal contact with the other apostles. So this was a major controversy that broke out in Antioch. It results in Paul's independence. And I think you're correct that it is grounded in Paul's complete conviction that his own stance is directly derived from his experience of the resurrection of Jesus and the imperative commission that was laid on him as a result of that experience.
Could you tell us a little bit about Lightfoot's advocacy of the Epiphanian view?
Yes, this involves the question of how we deal with the issue of Jesus' relatives. Fortunately, in the Gospel according to Mark, or earliest source in this regard, they are named, insofar as Jesus' brothers are concerned, as being James, Joses, and Simon, and Judas. And we're also told that Jesus has sisters. We don't know how many. All we have is the plural indicated in Mark 6:3. So the Epiphanian view of Epiphanius from the 4th century holds that these are, in fact, brothers and sisters, but not of the same mother. Now, one reason, it seems to me, to give some credence to the Epiphanian view is that if you imagine Mary and Joseph with 7 children, which it would be, counting the sisters as a minimum of 2, right? 7 children. And Joseph disappears from the scene of the Gospels from the time when Jesus is approximately 12 years old. It is very difficult to fit that kind of family in terms of birth times within the frame of life of Joseph indicated by the chronology. So for this reason, Lightfoot and others have tended towards the idea of Epiphanius. I must say, I myself favor a modified form of that point of view. That is, to see some of the children as deriving from an early marriage of Joseph with a woman, and then others from the time when Joseph, as a widower, married Mary. And that would enable this entire family to be named in the way that they are, without the assumption, which had also been argued in the time of Epiphanius, that all of them derived from Mary and Joseph, which, as I say, would be quite difficult.
And what do you make of Eisenman's view on the Gospel of James?
Robert Eisenman developed the argument that we should identify James, brother of Jesus, with the teacher of righteousness from Qumran. And as many reviewers have pointed out, in order to argue that case, Eisenman has had to recalibrate the archaeology of Qumran because it does not comport with the dates which are indicated for James on the basis of the best information that we have. That archaeological evidence has not held up well, so it's an identification I have not been able to subscribe to. And in fact, within our project that we conducted over a number of years, we specifically engaged experts on the study of Qumran to investigate that aspect of the study of James. And they came to the conclusion that the chronology and the archaeology doesn't add up in such a way as to support that thesis.
Yeah, I've had several videos in which I discussed this with in the past with Qumran scholars, other New Testament scholars, and I think that the simplest way for viewers, and as what I always recommend viewers, is to read a translation of the Damascus document.
Mm-hmm.
They don't want to understand the other complex reasons, but Damascus document tells you that the righteous teacher, or at least it appears to tell you, the righteous teacher lived in the early 2nd century BCE. Because it said something about 390 plus 20 years after the first temple was destroyed, which lands you around that time.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I would tend to agree with that usual chronology of the teacher of righteousness and indeed the Dead Sea Scrolls. I also think that the portrayal of James within the best sources that we have do not show him as being the kind of learned authority which is involved with the teacher of righteousness. Rather, James does, without any question, have authority within an understanding of what I would call the halakha of Jesus. That is, he stands as a kind of proto-rabbinic figure, taking his brother's teaching and molding it into a Mishnaic-like proposition, which people could understand, such as to practice the traditions of Israel with a participation from Gentiles. This is really unlike the perspective of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which rather sees the sons of light as being a very small group inside Israel, which are going to inherit all of the promises.
And what does Richard Buckham think about all this?
Yeah, Richard Buckham was a part of our work. He was early exponent of the Epiphanian view that you refer to. Uh, and it's rather interesting that he tended to support the view of Epiphanius on the family of Jesus, whereas John Meyer, in his book on Jesus, A Marginal Jew, portrayed Jesus more according to the teaching of Helvidius, according to whom, in fact, they are all blood relations, same mother, same father. It was a nice reversal of a Catholic scholar taking an historically Protestant position and vice versa. Having said that, as I mentioned, I think just as it's not plausible that the whole family came from Mary and Joseph, so I don't think that everyone else in the family but Jesus came from a previous marriage. Seems to me with that number of children, Joseph becomes a much less eligible proposition as a groom than he would be otherwise. And overall, within the spectrum between liberal and conservative, among those scholars who took part in our project, I think Richard would openly say that he identifies more with the conservative side.
To conclude, what do you think is the best way to view, in your opinion, what do you think is the best and most probable view on the historical James?
I think the most probable view is that James was a practitioner of Galilean Judaism who found himself at odds with his younger half brother while Jesus was making a way as a rabbi, but that then he came to see the wisdom of his brother's course, specifically when Jesus made his way to Jerusalem and the temple in order to insist upon the accessibility of the temple to the people of Israel. I think that was a primary axiom of the practice of James. Because he was involved in the events that took place in Jerusalem, including the crucifixion and then the resurrection, James himself had an experience of Jesus as being raised from the dead. Paul, his opponent, acknowledges this fact in 1 Corinthians 15. And as a result, James developed a characteristic practice, a halakha, of the Nazirite vow in the temple. That is, he regularly took part in temple worship. So basically, he embodied the presence of Jesus and his teaching within the temple in Jerusalem. As long as the temple stood, it was the center of Judaism, and it was also the most important center there was of Christianity. And for that reason, during that period, until the destruction of the temple in the year 70, either James, as long as he lived, which was until the year 62, or his memory were very much at the center of Christianity.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Bruce.
It's been my pleasure.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and/or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.